Good morning, everybody. You can hear me. Marvellous. I'm afraid I've had to put it in the top pocket because I realise I'm a bit tall for these wires and things. Otherwise I'd be dragged down like that. So we're carrying on our series called I'm In this morning. So what are we into today? Today we're talking about being influential. And I know those of you who know my job will go, oh, you are joking. James is going to bang on about getting into politics for half an hour. Well, no, it's not as simple as that, although that is very important, and we'll talk about that. And you can talk to Mandy about that afterwards, about becoming a councillor. But of course, what you do need to get into politics is for people to vote for you, which is what she managed to do, and I didn't. Spectacularly at the recent elections, yes. Thank you, Mandy. Anyway, I'd especially like to say welcome to Mrs. Pienaar, Lynette's mum. Who regularly watches us and gets to see us live today. It's great to have you with us. So, being an influencer. Now, when I say being an influencer, you'll immediately think of social media these days. Think of Instagram, Twitface, whatever it is these days. That very rich people own who go off into space when they're not running that. But let's have a think about the amount of people are influencing through social media. So David Beckham, we all know David Beckham. 79.3 million people follow him on Instagram. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, the man who modelled himself on me, he has 385 million. Selena Gomez, the actress, 423 million people follow her. Lionel Messi won the World Cup with Argentina, 476 million. And who's the top? Cristiano Ronaldo, with 593 million followers. Frankly, I'd rather follow that really odd bust that they made for him in that airport that didn't look anything like him. Anyway, just my personal view. Now, companies often hire these big names to promote their products because they think that their influence is going to lead to greater sales for their company. It's not a new concept. The rise of social media has just given people a voice that they wouldn't have had otherwise. Now, breaking news, folks. In the first century, social media didn't exist. And the greatest influencer of all, even bigger than Cristiano Ronaldo, is Jesus Christ. Matthew 5-7, the Sermon on the Mount, and much of it relates to being an influence for the kingdom. It begins with the familiar Beatitudes, the blessed life, characterized by being poor in spirit, merciful, meek, hungering and thirsting after righteousness, following those distinctive teaching of Jesus, and he calls us to be people of influence in the world around us. So let's just look at Matthew 5:13-16. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how will it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out to be trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. So what I want to say to you this morning is whether you like it or you don't, I don't particularly care, you are an influencer because you have character. Everyone has character. Some people have bad character. Some people have good. Some are honest, others are deceitful. Some are trustworthy, others are unreliable. And some have a great work ethic while others, frankly, are slackers. No matter what your character is like, you have one. And your character is going to influence those around you for good or for ill. The Bible says in 1 Corinthians, bad company corrupts good character. Basically, if you hang around with people who are bad influence, you'll begin to be like them. I think that the opposite is also true. If you hang around with people who are a good influence, you will begin to become like them. What the world today is desperately in need of is people of good character, who are going to influence those around them to live holy lives. If we in the church fail to do this, then who's going to? Because somebody's going to influence people. J. Oswald Sanders wrote, "If those who hold influence over others fail to lead towards the spiritual uplands, then surely the path to the lowlands will be well worn. People travel together. No one lives detached and alone." You know, people are always looking at us, especially when you say you're a Christian, for an example. I have to admit, when I was a lot younger, my friends always knew that I was a churchgoer. They always knew that I was a Christian. And some of the people I hung around with, still good friends of mine, their language incredibly fruity. And once we were doing something, and I hurt myself, and I admit, church, a bad word snuck out. And they all stopped. And I suddenly heard a, "Ooh, you're not supposed to say that." I'm reminded of a story of a minister who was doing some work on the church one day. He was doing some work outside the church. And he turned around and he saw a young lad from the town just watching him. Just stood there watching him. He said, "You all right?" Yeah, I'm fine. Thanks very much." So he carried on doing his job. 10 minutes later, turned around, this young lad still stood there, just watching him. "You okay?" "Absolutely fine. Yeah, thanks very much, Pastor." "Yeah." Carried on. This went on for about 30, 40 minutes. And eventually the pastor put down his tools, walked over, and he said, "Okay, you've been stood there for nearly an hour now. What's the problem?" He said, "Oh, there's nothing wrong, Pastor. I just want to see what a preacher says when he hits his hand with a hammer." It's essential that we as Christians stop complaining about the way things are and start changing the way things are. It won't happen, and you know, it takes a lot for me to have to say this, but it won't happen through an election. No matter how qualified the candidate, and believe me, I was a very qualified candidate. So was Mandy. It won't happen through a court decision, no matter how righteous the ruling. It won't happen through legislation, however good the cause. Change in our culture will happen as we influence those around us for Christ. You say that you're not a leader, that you're not in a position of influence. Not true. Everyone in this room is a leader. We all have influence on others. Paul J. Mayer said, "Everyone leaves a legacy, whether you have children or not." So how do you leave a legacy? Through influencing those who come behind you. Whether you be your children, your nieces, your nephews, your neighbours, those people you work with, or your friends, or even people you don't particularly know well. You are an influencer. Now, I'll always encourage Christians to get into the local council, to get into Parliament. That's my line of work until the next general election. Or governors of a local school or any kind of community group, because it's essential. I think it's essential that we have people influencing all these kind of bodies in a good way. But the main point this morning is you're an influence, whether you like it or not. You're called to be a good influence. Don't take it from me, take it from Jesus. Because before he ascended into heaven, Jesus said, "Go." One of the most important words in the Bible, I think. It's a 2-letter word. Go. Go and preach the good news that I've taught to you throughout the world. Go and be a good influence throughout the world. That's what we're all called to do. And the question this morning is, are you in? Are you in? We're in the break in the season at the moment of the Premier League, and all the various leagues, and of course, as I will preach from this pulpit many times, we all know that Aston Villa is the only decent team in the country. But apart from that, we'll often see managers getting sacked. There'll always be, they call it the sack race at the start of the season, to see which manager gets sacked first. And often you'll hear the same debate amongst all the wise heads they assemble to talk about these things. They'll say, well, one person will say, well, it wasn't fair that the manager got sacked because at the end of the day he sends the players out on the pitch and he can't play. They're the ones that are playing. It's not his fault that the goalkeeper let 3 goals through. It wasn't his fault that the striker couldn't hit a barn door with a banjo. But someone else will then say, but he's got to be the influence. The whole idea of the manager is to influence the goalkeeper so he doesn't miss those, is to influence the striker. If a coach doesn't have the ability to influence his team to do their best, then he isn't doing his job. And I would say the same could be said for the church and for the Christian. If we're not influencing our world for God, then we're not doing our job. Now do you see the importance of influence? Jesus teaches that each one of us is in possession of the power of influence that can be used to bring light and joy to the world. We're familiar with this because we know that those who've had a significant influence on our own lives, just by what we say to people, how we are with others, how we care, and especially how we model a life as a Christian, can have a huge influence on everyone around us. The Christian life is so different to what we see in society today that it should be impossible to hide. Our attitudes, our speech, our way of life, our devotion to God, we should be focused on others rather than ourselves. Everything that is opposite to what society tells you now. If we blend in too much to this world, we're losing our opportunity to defeat the darkness that is around us. The very existence of Christianity is a testimony to the power of influence. I told you about what Jesus said, go out into all the world. At that time, Christianity had hardly been heard about. Jesus had hardly been heard about outside that part of the world. And across the ages, godly men and women of faith who've gone before us have passed along what they knew and what they believed. They weren't social media influencers with millions of followers. They didn't go on Love Island. They weren't Premier League strikers, but they just did the job that they were called to do. It may have even just been a grandmother that none of us have ever heard of, passing on the word to as many people as she could around us, quietly, slowly, and effectively. The world needs the influence of Christ, because the world left to itself, as we see on our televisions every single night, will veer towards self-destruction. And we're called to be influencers who bring the influence of the kingdom into our world. So frankly, this should be a very simple message this morning, which is difficult to disagree with. If you've accepted Jesus as your saviour, if you're living the Christian life, then you're going to be a good influence on others around you. Otherwise, you're not doing your job properly. It's not very difficult, is it? So what hinders us? Let's go back to the verse we heard, Matthew 5. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. Well, unsalty salt really isn't salt at all. Pleased I got through that. Swindoll wrote, if we allow ourselves to be watered down, tasteless, bland, just like the world around us, Christians will lose our testimony and thus our ability to add meanings to people's lives. This is a warning Jesus offers so that we recognise that if we ignore our influence, we're going to lose it. So when we're indifferent, when we have a lack of concern for our world around us, when we just focus on our own lives without concern for others, our saltiness begins to go away. The old phrase, use it or lose it, springs to mind. Also, we can be ineffective When we fail to live up to our potential, we have negative attitudes, we're focused on the material things in life, we're focused on self. By the way, I'm guilty of all these things, and I think we all have to be aware of it, because life is life. And a big danger for everybody is when we become indistinguishable. Oswald Chambers actually said that many Christians want to be the sugar of the world. We want to smile at everybody. We don't want to give them the bad news. We don't want to talk about hell. We don't want to talk about the eternal darkness that many people in society are heading for unless they learn about Jesus. We just want to give them the nice cuddly stuff. And you know what? I would say that I think modern Christianity is in danger of becoming indistinguishable. We agree with everything that everybody thinks. We don't want people to think that we might have a controversial opinion. Some denominations, I feel, are very much going down that line. But actually, when we become indistinguishable, we lose our ability to be influential. In the book of Galatians chapter 1, we find that Paul was a person of influence. It says there, "Then I began my ministry in the regions of Syria and Cilicia. After all that time and activity, I was still unknown by face among the Christian churches in Judea. There was only this report. That man who once persecuted us is now preaching the very message he used to try to destroy. Their response was to recognize and worship God because of me." Their response was to recognize and worship God because of me. Here we see that Paul was an influencer. He influenced the Galatians to recognize and worship God. And how did he do that? He was a God pleaser, not a people pleaser. Paul became a man of influence because he knew the difference between trying to please people and trying to influence people. He knew the difference between being a people pleaser and being a people leader. Now he actually says it in the Bible, obviously I'm not trying to be a people pleaser, no, I'm trying to please God. If I was still trying to please people, I would not be Christ's servant. Now it goes without saying, this is something that's far easier said than done. I'm a people pleaser, many of us are. In your job you might be torn between pleasing your boss or pleasing God. At home you might be torn between pleasing your spouse and pleasing God. And in your personal life you might be torn between pleasing yourself in what you want to do with your life and pleasing God. Now I know some of you might be thinking, there's maybe a loophole somewhere here. Maybe I can please God and everybody else at the same time. But God is really the only one that you're able to please. Because first of all, he's the only one who says point blank, this is what I want from you. This is what I expect from you. You can read through the Bible and come away knowing exactly what God wants from you. And other people don't give you such clear signals. They say one thing and actually mean another, and they expect you to figure it out. Secondly, God is the only one who's going to enable you to do exactly what he expects. Only God says, I want you to love me, and then fills your heart with love. He's the only one who says, I want you to be kind, and then fills you with kindness. He's the only one who says, I want you to stop committing that sin, and then gives you the power to turn away from it. With everybody else, you're on your own. With everybody but God, you're on your own to meet their expectations. Now that doesn't mean that Paul never tried to do anything that was pleasing to someone else. Nor does that mean that you should go home today and say to your spouse, no, I'm not going to empty the dishwasher because James says I've only got to please God. I don't want those texts later today, if you don't mind. But the same Paul who said I'm not a people pleaser also said I've become all things to all men so that by all possible means I might save some. So how do we recognize those? Well, Paul never sought to please people at the expense of pleasing God. He knew who his master was and he knew where to draw the line. He said in verse 10, if I were still trying to please people, I would not be Christ's servant. Jesus gives us the answer in Matthew 6. No one can serve two masters. Adoration of one feeds contempt for the other. Here's the key. Who you want to please most in life is going to determine how much and what kind of influence you have. If you choose to try and please your spouse and your boss and your friends, you'll actually only have a limited influence on their lives. And that'll lead to frustration. But if you choose to please God, then you're going to have a God-sized influence on your world. You'll have a God-sized influence on your spouse, your friends, your co-workers. And I know that there are different kinds of people, and there are folks who are going to be worried about what other people think. I'm one of those. And this is going to be a tough assignment. And I think most of us fall into that category. We don't want people to think that we're boring or stupid or weird. We want people to like us. And for some people, your whole self-esteem might be wrapped up in what others think of you. And if that's you, then you need to be continually reminding yourself whose opinion will ultimately count. Remind yourself that on the day of judgment, you don't have to answer to your spouse, your boss, your co-workers, your friends, but to God. You need to readjust your way of thinking and accept the fact that to please God, you'll have to possibly do some unpopular things. You need to be a God pleaser to be an influence, not a people pleaser. And I also want to tell you that you have to stick with it for the long haul. You have to be a God pleaser before you'll be willing to let God set the agenda for your life. And when God sets the agenda, you have to stick with it for the long haul. And it doesn't happen overnight. There's a tale told. There was a great English actor called William Charles Macready. Lived a long time ago. But an eminent preacher at the time said to him, "I wish you would explain to me something. What is the reason for the difference between you and me? You're appearing before crowds night after night with fiction, and the crowds will come and pack out theatres wherever you go. I'm preaching the essential and unchangeable truth, and I'm not getting any crowd at all." Macready's answer was this: "It's quite simple. I present my fiction as though it were truth. You present your truth as though it were fiction." Basically, William Macready was telling the pastor that he lacked credibility, and that until he'd established credibility or believability, he shouldn't really expect people to listen to what he had to say. So what does this have to do with us this morning? It takes time to establish credibility. When you're a rookie at anything, you have to first prove yourself before you'll be taken seriously. And this was even true of Paul. If we read through the account of his ministry, it took him a long time to establish credibility. His message and ministry weren't based on a short-term whim. He and his ministry took the test of time. And if you want to build credibility, then you must stick with it for the long haul. Don't expect that it'll be popular or accepted by everyone right away. First, you need to prove yourself. And that means investing in the time to build credibility. Investing in the time to be a God pleaser, not a people pleaser. Investing in the time to get alongside people. Investing in the time to prove to people that you are different. Don't expect it all to happen tomorrow. Be prepared to hang in there and stick with it for the long haul. And if it is of God, then it'll happen. If you are interested in American sports, there's an NBA superstar called Charles Barkley who made a controversial statement a few years ago where he said, "I don't want to be anyone's role model." And in his defense, his point was that some guy on a TV screen shouldn't be the role model for the youth of America. I agree with him. He thought parents and teachers should be role models, not highly paid athletes. But whether he liked it or not, whether he wanted to be or not, he was a role model to many. We're all role models in some way, shape or form. We are people with influence. Every day you influence your children, your grandchildren, your employer, your employees, your co-workers, your friends, your neighbours, and even people that you bump into in the street. Unless you live in complete isolation, and the fact you are here this morning proves that you don't. You are having an influence on others. The question is, what kind of influence are you having? Positive or negative, good or bad? If you want to be able to say, as we read from the Bible this morning about Paul, they recognized and worshipped God because of me, then don't even think about trying to please people. Focus on being a God pleaser, then devote yourself to discovering God's agenda for your life and be dedicated to it for the long haul so you can establish credibility. That's how you can say, I'm in to being a person of influence. You're an influencer in ways you'll never know. Keep your heart tender to let God work within it. It's impossible to re-salt salt. But in the kingdom, God can restore the saltiness of his people. And the exciting thing is, we'll never really know how our influence is going to travel and bring blessings to others in life. Just as I close, there's a story of a Sunday school teacher, a guy named Edward Kimball. Anyone heard of him? Nope. He's just a Sunday school teacher in the United States. But he shared the gospel with a shoe shop assistant. And the shoe shop assistant gave his life to Jesus. And that shoe shop assistant was called D.L. Moody. And you may know of the influential work of Moody as an evangelist. And he then travelled to England. He inspired a young pastor named F.B. Mayer. Mayer is also a well-known teacher and evangelist. He actually became one of the great Bible expositors, and his books are still read today. He then went to the United States, preached on college campuses, and was used to convert a student to Christ called Wilbur Chapman. Chapman would hear Moody preach and become one of his co-workers. He then employed an ex-baseball player as his assistant. His name was Billy Sunday. Billy Sunday became a great evangelist and preached in Charlotte, North Carolina. Also at the same place, an evangelist named Mordecai Ham, that's a great name, came to preach in a tent meeting. And one night, responding to the preaching of Mordecai Ham and giving his name to Jesus was a young man called Billy Graham. There's probably no other minister who's more well known than Billy Graham. And this all occurred because a Sunday school teacher decided to share the gospel with a shoe shop assistant. When we live out the Jesus life, we'll never know who we may influence. But God can use your godly example to have a large influence over time. You may wonder if you're influencing anybody at all. But seeds are being planted, prayers are being answered, and there is hope, even after we've all gone. The life you lived will still be influencing those who remember you, and hopefully lots of people who never knew you at all. Jesus said in John 8:12, I am the light of the world. He who follows me will never walk in the darkness, but will have the light of life. Because of the influence of Jesus, you are the light of the world. Are you in?